o'clock, you can set off. So welcome everybody. Shall we begin? Before that, let me just make some announcements which the director has asked me to make. On the 25th at 3 o'clock, we have a seminar by Professor on partition violence in Punjab in 1947. 26th, Tuesday, at 3 o'clock again, a weekly seminar. Dr. Kamalnayan Jobe, Junior Fellow at DNML. Law is the site of contestation between state and margin, Forest Rights Act and the politics of marginal society. On 27th, Wednesday, at 3 o'clock, the public lecture in the India and the Wider World series. Professor Blitzanka, Institute of Chinese Studies. India and Japan, Varieties of Asian Regionals. Well, I'll leave to that. There's a long list which follows, but I shan't announce the lot straight away. It gives me great pleasure to welcome my colleague from JNU, one time, Professor Varun Sahni. I think very, very well known in the world of international relations and otherwise of history also. He has worked upon various aspects of international relations, quite a considerable range of it all, but especially the focus on Latin American region, which is not necessarily the most widely known in India, unfortunately. So he brings with him a very great specialist expertise on this region, in addition to the broad-ranging understanding of the wider world. He has been in JNU and is in JNU and so many interesting places in Mexico, the National Defense University of Washington, the Australian National University, Canberra, was awarded the Vicary Prize here for Social Sciences in 2006, and has been Vice Chancellor at Jammu University. And fortunately, he's not remaining in pure administrative work. He's back with us at serious research, and we get the benefit of it today as he speaks about problematizing the BRICS. The Southern Hemisphere, Grandeza, Northern Hemisphere, geopolitics.
Thanks ever so much, Chairperson, and it's wonderful being here this afternoon with all of you. Thanks a lot to the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library to ask me to come, and it's great to have this public lecture series on India and the wider world, and to see international relations embedded with a bunch of other social science disciplines and not treated as a kind of a standalone. So which is, I think, something that is desperately needed as far as my academic discipline is concerned. I've got a rather long talk, and hopefully halfway through it, you'll understand why it's so long, and you wouldn't have fallen asleep. So I'm going to sort of not going to stick very much. I'm going to go straight into the meat of the matter. Essentially, thinking about the BRICS. Oh boy. Okay, what do I do? Okay, hang on. Actually, I'm not illustrated yet. Sorry. Got it. That's brilliant. Now how do we get back? Okay. Let's first understand one thing very clearly. The genesis of the BRICS is in a U.S. investment bank. It's in Goldman Sachs. And I'm going to keep getting back to this point over and over again. And I hope by the end of it I will convince you that this is a non-trivial issue. Really, there were 3 papers written by Goldman Sachs. I brought them up here on the screen for you. The first paper in 2001, another in 2003, and a third in 2005. They're all very short papers. They're sort of the sorts of papers that investment banks bring down. And this is where the BRICS appeared for the first time. Please note that this was still BRIC with a small x. because, this was at this time projected as being really a group of 4 countries and not 5. Now, I mentioned those 3 Goldman Sachs papers, so the thrust of those studies are actually very different. The 2001 paper really emphasized the importance of reorganizing global policy making to include these 4 countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. The 2003 study focused on the future size of these economies relative to the size of the largest developed economies. And the 2005 study actually highlighted the impact of the BRICS on the world economy and upon globalization. So, there is in fact a subtle difference in all 3 of these papers. After that, Goldman Sachs has sort of made a lot of money on this, presumably, but there's not been very much more by way of output that's come out. So, if the genesis, if the birth was in a U.S. investment bank, the nursing of this group of countries has really been through summit diplomacy. And I'd like to just very quickly bring to your attention 4 summits, starting with the summit in Ekaterinburg in Russia in 2009, the Brasilia summit in Brazil in 2010, the summit in China at Sahni city in 2011, the New Delhi summit last year here, and we have a 5th summit just rolling up in March. This is going to be in Durban, South Africa. As summits are wont to do, we've had joint statements coming out from them. We've had declarations coming out from the first 4. These declarations basically are lots of things there, but an emphasis on further strengthening collaboration between the BRICS, promoting dialogue and cooperation in an incremental, proactive, pragmatic, open, and transparent way. A clear emphasis in these documents on transforming the structures of global governance, and also another point to note, just to keep the focus on summit diplomacy for another 30 seconds. If you would look at the English versions of these documents, the size just keeps increasing. The joint statement at Ekaterinburg is 988 words. It becomes 2,444 words in Brasilia, goes up to 2,674 words in Sahni, and the Delhi Declaration is already 4,424 words. So, we need to sort of just ask in some ways, why is this happening? And why is it that every year when the top leadership of these countries meet, they're having more to say? And that's one of the questions really that I want to ask, is there really greater group ambition? Is there group cohesion here? Or is it just some sort of a diplomatic pressure? There are heads of state and government involved. So you've got to show, the career diplomats have to show that there's something new coming out. But there isn't very much there. And that really in some ways, right out there, is a problem that I want to sort of lay out in front of you. So what am I going to do in this talk then? I'm going to try to sort of really do 4 things. I'm going to first spend some time comparing these 4 later 5 countries. And I'm going to ask, do the BRICS fit together? How well do they fit together? I'm going to then problematize them. I'm going to suggest there are 4 fundamental problems to the way the BRICS have been constructed, and there's one, what I see as a non-problem, which sometimes gets in the way and confuses the other 4 problems, which are very substantial. I don't want to spend a bit of time, because the first 2 are really in some ways hatchet jobs. I'm telling you what the problems are with the BRICS, but I'm going to then sort of set up a bit of an antithesis there and suggest that, in fact, there are today core challenges of global governance, and in fact, it's very difficult to see how we're going to come to any kind of a reasonable solution with regards to these issues of global governance unless the BRICS are integrally involved in them. So, in a way, I'm going to, after first telling you why I see all sorts of problems, I'll then sort of tell you what, in a way the BRICS, why I think the BRICS are still relevant. And then finally, by way of synthesis almost, I'll suggest what some of the future directions for this grouping of states can be. So let's start off by comparing the BRICS then, very quickly. Russia, let's look at it first in terms of territory. Russia, by far the largest country in territorial expanse, 80% larger than China, more than double the size of Brazil. So So, right out there you can see that there are some very interesting asymmetries. India and South Africa, which are actually geographically large countries, are really small in comparison to Russia. In terms of population statistics, demography, by 2015 it's estimated that India, with 1.318 billion people would have almost caught up with China. It will be estimated about 1.373 billion by then. Brazil and Russia, with the 204 million and 141 million people, will also be large countries in terms of population. What I will also suggest to you is that of these 5 countries, only India and South Africa today have total fertility ratios which are higher than 2.1. 2.1 is important because 2.1 is the population replacement rate. Basically, the TFR, for those in this room who may not know what it is, on average the number of children a woman has in a particular society. And 2.1 because obviously some children die, so basically 2.1 becomes in the way the replacement rate. What this means therefore is that Russia, China and Brazil are going to actually be facing demographic decline now. They are going to have rapidly aging populations in comparison to India and South Africa. What about the economy? China already in 2010 had a GDP of $5.9 trillion US. Brazil, India and Russia came next with $2 trillion, $1.7 trillion and $1.4 trillion. South Africa, has an economy which is quarter the size of Russia's. So, it's the only non-trillion dollar economy among the BRICS countries. What about military spending? Well, Russia spends about 4% of its GDP on defense. India spends 2.4%, China is currently spending 2.0%. Brazil and South Africa, well, perhaps because their external security environments are far more peaceful than that of the other 3 countries, are spending far less in the military capability. 1.6%, 1.2% of GDP. What about such things as gross capital formation, which means really, what size of your GDP is going into building plants that is actually, capital which is actually productive. We can see that the Chinese and Indian economies are ones with the largest gross capital formation percentages, 47.8% and 34.8% of GDP respectively. That means basically almost half of the Chinese economy is going into essentially, gross capital formation going into productive plant. The gross capital formation in Russia, Brazil and South Africa are of course much lower. What else? If you were to look at revenue collection, China and India remain the weakest BRICS countries, but that is not a surprise. They both have large rural populations, poor populations. So obviously the extractive capacity of these states is far less than in the case of Brazil and Russia and South Africa. In terms of debt service ratios, the 2 countries that have problems are Brazil and Russia. Brazil actually spends 19% of its total exports going to external debt servicing. In the case of Russia, it's 12.8%. The external debt situation of all the other countries is comparatively comfortable. Now, if you were to look at sort of the sectoral splits in the economies, what you'll see is that in India's case, the agricultural sector is about 19% of GDP in value-added terms. This is a much larger share of the economy compared to the other BRICS. The share of China's agrarian sector is now only 10.1% of GDP. That's nearly half that in terms of sectoral share that India has. In the case of China, in fact, it is largely all about its industrial sector. 46.8% of the Chinese economy in sectoral terms is industrial. Service sector dominates in the others. High-tech exports. As you can see, I'm throwing out a whole bunch of data and I'm trying to draw a bunch of contrasts here. There's the bottom line, I promise you. The share of high technology exports in relation to total exports, China, 27.5% of all Chinese exports were high technology exports, 11.2% in the case of Russia, and in the case of all the other BRICS countries, the high-tech component of exports are way, way, way lower. So again, China really is in a very different category from all the others, including Russia. What about indicators of development? Well, here's one. The annual per capita electric power consumption in Russia in 2009 was over 6,000 kilowatt hours. South Africa was 4,500 odd kilowatt hours. China was 2,600 kilowatt hours. Brazil was about 2,200 kilowatt hours. India is currently at 570 kilowatt hours in per capita terms. Just to give you an idea, if you use per capita electric power consumption as an indicator of levels of social development, you can see that India just is in a completely different league, even from Brazil. It's a third less than Brazil. It's 12 times less than Russia in terms of how much of electric power an average Indian consumes compared to an average Russian. And of course, there's no such thing as an average Indian or average Russian. And this is actually reflected in data on carbon dioxide emissions. The annual per capita carbon dioxide emission data, 2008, was 12 metric tons for Russia, 8.9 metric tons for South Africa, 5.3 metric tons for China, 2.1 metric tons for Brazil, and a mere 1.5 metric tons for India. Which in the context of the whole bunch of discussion on climate change and those issues, I think is very important for us to keep in mind. The gross national income per capita data, Russia is the richest BRICS country. The GNI per capita is about almost $10,000 US. Brazil comes next at 9,390, South Africa at 6,000. China at 4,200, India at 1,270. So again, you can see that there are clear differences in terms of per capita income. And this ranking, by the way, between these countries does not alter at all if GNI were to be calculated in purchasing power parity terms. What about human development indicators? Here, Russia is the best of all the BRICS countries. Its human development index now stands at 0.755. That's 66th. Brazil is pretty much level pegging with Russia. It's at the 84th rank at 0.718. China comes at the 101st rank. South Africa at the 123rd rank. And India, of course, as we all know, is abysmally low. It's at the 134th rank with a HDI score of 0.547. However, and this is interesting, I think, in the 2000 to 2011 period, if you were to look at income disparities, the income quintile share ratio. Income quintile share ratio, incidentally, is how much more the richest 20% of the population earns relative to the poorest 20% of the population. In terms of the income quintile share ratio, India actually is the best of the lot. That stands at 5.6 in the case of India. It indicates really that India is economically speaking the most egalitarian of the BRICS countries. The income quintile share ratios of China and Russia are 8.4 and 8.2. South Africa is at 20.2 and Brazil at 17.6. South Africa and Brazil, let us keep in mind, are two of the most economically unequal countries in the world. Brazil used to be the worst, but actually Brazil's income distribution data has improved considerably over the last few years. South Africa still remains in pretty bad shape as far as that indicator is concerned. Female life expectancy at birth, best for Brazil, 77 years, China 75, Russia 75 as well, India at 67. South Africa, because of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in South Africa, pretty devastated at the moment. The figures actually for South Africa are at 54.1. I think a lot of us actually underestimate and do not fully understand the extent to which HIV/AIDS has ravaged Southern Africa and other parts of Africa as well. But the female to male ratio, life expectancy is actually pretty positive in all of the countries. Infant mortality rate, per 1,000 live births is how it's expressed usually. in the 2010-2015 years projected to be 11 for Russia, 19 for Brazil, 20 for China. India and South Africa are the worst off at 48 and 46. And this is reflected by this other bit of data. The percentage of infants between the ages of 12 and 23 months immunized against measles is near universal in the case of Brazil, Russia, and China. That means that almost 100% of the kids are immunized against measles. It's still only 74% in the case of India, 65% in the case of South Africa. The adult literacy rate is near universal in Russia. Basically all adults in Russia, we can consider them to be literate. It's very high in China, 94%, 90% in the case of Brazil, 89% in the case of South Africa, and it's still a rather low 63% in the case of India. The adult literacy rate, male-female ratio is low in India again, 0.68, compared with 1 in the case of Brazil, 1 in the case of Russia, and almost 1 in the case of South Africa and China. What this basically means that there is no disparity in the male-female ratio as far as adult literacy is concerned. In the other 4 BRICS countries, it is still a problem. In India, that means that for every 10 adult men in India who are literate, there are only 7 women who are. What else? Access to improved drinking water sources. Again, 97% Brazil, 96% Russia, 91% South Africa, 89% China, 88% India. Actually, the sanitation facilities in urban areas, the data is actually quite surprising. When I looked at it, I was a bit surprised myself. 86% for South Africa, 85% for Brazil, 74% for both China and Russia, and only 58% for India. That means essentially that in urban areas, we're not talking about rural areas, only 58% of urban dwelling Indians have access to improved sanitation facilities, but it's not particularly good either in China or Russia either. And again, just one final little bit of data before we sum up this part of what I wanted to lay up before all of you. Cell phone subscriptions, there are more cell phones than there are people in Russia, Brazil, and South Africa, which means that, a substantial number of people have more than one cell phone connection. In China, it's still 64%. In India, it is 61%. Okay, now, before I get on to the next section, the point that I wanted to make in this section is the following. That, when you look at a whole bunch of different indicators, economic, socio-economic, human development indicators, you can see quite clearly that these are in some ways 5 very different countries. Now, it doesn't mean that very different countries cannot join a grouping. It doesn't mean that very different countries cannot work together. But this facile way in which people, I think, in some ways characterize the BRICS, as a group of countries which are very similarly situated. I think it's very important to point out that, in fact, if you look at these data, there are in fact huge disparities between these countries. Let me move on to the second point, the second sort of problem that I wanted to lay out before you, which is actually problematizing the BRICS. These data tell us something, but, well, having said that, what are the problems with the BRICS? And I see 4 fundamental problems in the way the BRICS group or grouping has been constructed, and I think all 4 of these have a negative impact on group cohesion. The first of them, and I'm going to speak at some length about on all 4 of them, are the origins of the BRICS as a concept framed and imposed from the outside that is now sought to be internalized. Secondly, sorry, I can see that I put some letters in blue to emphasize, but I can see that it's actually making it difficult for you to read. I should have just left it in white. I thought I was helping you out. But well, certainly lies in the tropics, I guess. But the first, let me just read it out again. It's the origins, it's a concept framed and imposed from the outside. The second is, the varying motives of the 5 states. Why are they part of the BRICS? Why do they want to be part of the BRICS? And the different approaches to issues of power transition and status transformation. The third concern that I have is that the fundamental differences exist in their current location in the global power structure, and hence these 5 countries have dissimilar aspirations, and their trajectories also are likely therefore to be dissimilar. The fourth concern I have is the impact of geopolitics, particularly in Eurasia, upon the BRICS. And I want to then suggest what I said earlier was a non-problem, which is the nature of the domestic political system. I really don't think, and I'll try to tell you why I think so, that it's not really a relevant factor in assessing group cohesion of the BRICS. Okay, let's look at the first of the problems then, an externally imposed category that is now being internalized. If the BRICS are to become a viable grouping, I would suggest to you that they have to overcome their O'Neill, Goldman Sachs conception and conceptualization. And so far, despite their annual summit meetings, ambitious agenda, and favorable systemic context, and let's not forget the systemic context is favorable. Given the problems that the United States, the European Union has been facing, the grouping has not really succeeded in getting past its genesis. I suggest to you also that the BRICS countries have not been able to substantially move away from the 3 interlinked arguments made in the Goldman Sachs papers. And what were those interlinked arguments? The indispensable need to 1. Reorganize global governance structures to include the BRICS because of 2. The future size of the BRICS economies, and 3. The impact of the BRICS on the world economy and globalization. That was basically the Goldman Sachs argument, and it is actually going to go into a serious analysis of the BRICS after these 4 summit meetings, getting into the 5th summit meeting. You don't really see that anything really substantially has changed from that original Goldman Sachs formulation. So, despite some novel initiatives, the BRICS appears, at least to me, to be stuck in a predetermined groove. They are playing the part of global governance transformation that in some ways has been assigned to them from the outside. And I believe, and I will make this point a little later on in my talk, for the BRICS to evolve out of their origin and predetermined presence, they will minimally have to give themselves a new name. I actually put a fair deal of emphasis on this. And the reason is this, because names matter in international politics, just as they do in daily human life. And I'll give you just one example of this. The non-aligned movement is routinely dismissed by rhetorically asking, well, what exactly are they non-aligned against when the world itself is no longer bipolar? That's a standard critique of the non-aligned movement today. It's banal, the extent to which this critique is leveled against NAM. And when you pose a rhetorical question, what you conveniently ignore is the transformation of the NAM agenda in the late 1970s and early 1980s from East-West polarity to the North-South divide. Organically, the non-aligned movement moved on, shifted its agenda, and the North-South divide remains one of the core problems and issues of world politics and international system today. And yet, because this grouping has not bothered to change its name, it continues to be regarded as being irrelevant. Because it is regarded as being irrelevant by outsiders, it tends to see itself as being irrelevant. It tends to make a ritual out of its interactions. So names matter. Names matter a great deal in international politics. And I think one of the biggest problems with the BRICS is that you've got 5 countries, massive countries, some of them, supposedly challenging the way the international system is currently configured, that actually have officially adopted the name given to them by a U.S. investment bank. I think it's a core issue, and therefore that's the one that I front load when I sort of laid before you what I consider to be the 4 problems the way the BRICS have been currently configured. My second kind of sense of the problem is that I suggest varying motives and different approaches. I think all 5 of these countries have different reasons for being in the BRICS, and they are, I think, fundamentally different approaches to the BRICS. They supposedly, on surface, have a common motive, and that is that Together, they had the ability that they individually lacked to challenge the current structures of global governance. So ostensibly, there is a common motive that ties all 5 of these countries together. But I would suggest in reality, each of the 5 BRICS countries has had a different reason, a different motive for getting involved in the grouping. For Russia, the decision was entirely political. It was an attempt to break out of the international isolation in which Russia found itself after the Georgian crisis of August 2008. And the BRICS grouping, in a way, some of you will be well aware of this, others perhaps not, is really a variant of an idea that goes back in Russian thinking to the late 1990s when Evgeny Primakov, the Russian Prime Minister, a student, an Asianist, a student of South Asia, an academic who became a Prime Minister during that confused Yeltsin period, he came up with the idea of a Big Three alliance consisting of China, Russia, and India to counterbalance an increasingly assertive and offensive NATO. And in a way, BRICS, in the way it came about in 2008-9, the idea was just that this very important southern hemispheric country, Brazil, got added to this group. So you had Brazil, China, India, anyway as a part of Soviet thinking, Russian thinking for a very long time, and then Brazil gets added on to this. The first BRICS summit in Ekaterinburg was a reminder to the US, to the European Union, to NATO, that Russia still held many cards in its hands. Taking Russia for granted would not be a sensible strategy for the United States, for NATO, and for the European Union. And there are many, many elements in terms of the cards in Russia's hands. The economic crisis that hit the developed economies, hydrocarbon politics, NATO's need for alternate transit routes to Afghanistan, the nuclear ambitions of Iran and North Korea. All of these were factors that I think Russia used quite adroitly in the period 2008 onwards to reposition itself vis-a-vis the West. What about China? The BRICS grouping provides China with an excellent opportunity to challenge the status quo at very low cost to itself. Because, let's accept it, China has to challenge the status quo sooner rather than later, given the accretion of Chinese capabilities relative to the capabilities of everybody else. The Chinese may no longer talk about their peaceful rise, may not talk about their harmonious development. It doesn't really matter what a region China characterizes the accretion of its capabilities as. The fact of the matter is that when a continent-sized country starts growing for a period of 30 years at the rate at which China has grown, it fundamentally transforms global balances. And any transformation of global balances is always minimally, unstable. It could be a lot more, but minimally it's unstable. So as a rising power, China has enormous incentive in challenging the status quo, but the BRICS allows China to do so at relatively low cost to itself. The BRICS grouping has also done one very important thing. It has allowed China to circumvent the attempt by India to keep it outside of IPSA. Now I need to take a detour for about 35 seconds to tell you what IPSA is, so those of you may not know what it is. It's a triangular grouping of India, Brazil, and South Africa. That has really from about 2003 onwards in a rather low-key way, but also buttressed by a summit process, built very substantive multi-sectoral South-South cooperation. There's a lot of it actually. There's a lot of stuff going on under the IPSA. China wanted to become a part of IPSA. And Indian diplomacy played this card, I thought, rather well. I mean, they didn't ever say no, but they kept suggesting to the Brazilians and South Africans, really, but the whole point about us was that we were, major southern democracies. I mean, that was one of the bases of our being together. China, does China fit, and this was something which, when put in that very delicate, look, we are not opposed to China, it's a neighboring country, blah, 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 but sort of, the Brazilians and the South Africans sort of always saw the point. And what China did was that it actually did something very, very interesting. It invited South Africa to join the BRICS during the Sahni summit in 2011. And, in effect, I suggest by doing so, China made INSA redundant. So ultimately, in a way, even the Indian diplomacy, I think, on this was rather good. Ultimately, India was outflanked by China. When China was the host at the third summit, they just called South Africa. So you already had Brazil and India there. South Africa joined. Obviously, nobody could say no to South Africa being there. I'll talk about that in about 30 seconds. And therefore, I predict that in the future it is extremely likely that IPSA summits will take place on the sidelines of BRICS summits. So, one day before the BRICS summits, these three heads of state will meet quietly in a corner room and sign a few agreements. Before I think IPSA itself fades into oblivion. And I think that would be, and really would be in some ways, tragic. But there you have it. That's the way world politics functions. What about Brazil? Brazil's perception of the role of the BRICS, I would suggest to you, seems to be anchored in its prior understanding of IPSA and of Mercosur. Mercosur is the common market of the South, which is the regional integration project in the southern cone of South America. That has largely been driven by Brazil and Argentina, includes Uruguay and Paraguay. Chile is still not a part of the process. Venezuela now has entered, which sort of gives new definitions to what is the southern cone, of course, but maybe that's a group that will need to change its name too one day. Now, in a way, Brazilians have come about an understanding of the BRICS, which in some ways is linked to their understanding of IPSA and of Mercosur. And this is what the Brazilians are very fond of calling as variable geometry. They say that there are these variable geometries of multiple international coalitions. This is what I meant in some ways by the southern hemisphere of Grandeza. Grandeza is a Portuguese term for grandeur. French foreign policy is also a foreign policy of grandeur. So by the way, it's not uniquely Brazilian. But of course, the Brazilians have a very deep sense that it's only a matter of time before their country becomes one of the system-shaping powers, becomes a great power. They see their country as being the first country that will emerge from the southern hemisphere as a great power. And they never say, if it will emerge, or when it will emerge. Of course, the Brazilians, being Brazilians, also have a joke, which is to say that Brazil is always emerging and will never emerge, which is something that I think many Indians also share as a sentiment. But be that as it may, that happens with large rural countries, I guess. And there are two very distinguished Brazilian scholars, Amancio Jorge de Oliveira and Janina Onuki, who come up, in fact, with a very interesting matrix to try to disentangle the variable geometry of Brazilian diplomacy. They are both at the University of Sao Paulo at USP, and they're very fine scholars. And this is what they come up with. They say, look, if you actually compare Mercosur, IPSA, and the BRICS across three parameters of interdependence, symbolic and normative significance, and asset for global governance, you can see that Mercosur scores very high on interdependence. Obviously, it's a regional integration process. IPSA scores very low on interdependence. The BRICS are somewhere in between. If you consider it in terms of symbolic and normative significance, then Mercosur is about medium, according to these two scholars. IPSA has very high symbolic and normative significance as three southern democracies and so on and so forth. And the BRICS have in fact very low symbolic and normative significance. And they argue that when it comes to whether it can be used as an asset for global governance, then for Mercosur, after all, it's a regional integration process, it's extremely low. It's medium in the case of IPSA, and it's very high in the case of the BRICS. I actually find it a very interesting way to disentangle these threads, and so I've appropriated it from their work. And I'm actually quite sold and convinced that this is a very, very useful way of looking at it. So the BRICS are then viewed as the best asset for Brazil at the global level, since Mercosur is no longer seen to be providing global leverage for Brazil, and IPSA is seen as being largely symbolic or normative value. What about South Africa? China's invitation to South Africa to join the BRICS summit at Sahni in 2011, as I said, was an initiative that was welcomed by all the other three countries, Russia, India, and China. And it could be said that they had virtually no choice in the matter. And I think it says something about South Africa's moral heft in international politics today. It would have been impossible, to have opposed that, frankly. But for South Africa, it's a pretty big deal being in the BRICS. So as you've seen in the data that I gave you in the first part of my talk, South Africa actually doesn't fit very easily at all. It's way smaller than the others in terms of territory, in terms of population, in terms of economy. It doesn't fit very easily. Being singled out from among all the African countries to be a part of BRICS does two things for South Africa. It bolsters South Africa's self-perception as an active global citizen and a leader in Africa. And secondly, it strengthens South Africa's claim to a permanent role in global governance. And these are both for South African diplomacy, South African politics, I'll argue, very, very important issues. And there's one positive feature in South Africa's presence, which is that South Africa's presence in the BRICS, I think, will long-term have a positive impact on the development cooperation dimension of the group. And we can see that already in terms of the focus of the BRICS summit to be held in Durban in March this year. It's explicitly partnering with Africa, which in fact all the other four countries were a bit spooked by, because none of them had brought their reasons into it when the summit was held, when they hosted the summit. South Africa unhesitatingly made the summit in Durban about Africa. And that's a classic sort of indicator of the way the South African diplomacy works. And I think this may, in the long run, be seen by some of us who watch these things as actually being a positive development. What about India? Well, India is in the BRICS because it cannot afford to be, in a way out of the grouping. It's how do you stay out? As I say, it's the only vowel in this group. If India wasn't there, they'd be called Prak, and then you'd have to think about some other thing to call them. So, the I out there, actually is important even linguistically. But I suggest that one way of looking at it is to say that ideological and pragmatic strands have coexisted in Indian foreign policy from the very beginning of India's existence as an independent nation, as a republic, as a sovereign territorial state. And an ideological opposition to hierarchy in the international system has gone hand in hand with a pragmatic willingness to achieve the best possible position for India within the system. And you can see many sort of, aspects of this. These two strands run parallelly, I would suggest. But I'll say something else that I hope will be controversial in this room, but it's something that I do believe in. I really think that of all the BRICS countries, India is easily the most positively inclined towards the US of these five. And it's an important point. I recognize the contentious point. India's domestic politics remains resolutely divided on the issue of India-US relations. No doubt about that at all. And therefore, being a part of the BRICS moderates and levels out any supposed proximity that New Delhi may have with Washington. And that actually works out to be quite positive for domestic politics as well. So the government of India, I think, the BRICS are important in that sense, partly as domestic balance. It's sort of, any accusation of sort of, whatever is the government of the day getting too close to the United States, and we've seen both the NDA and the UPA do it in different ways. You can also say, look, hold on, but there are so many other, we are a large country, we have many different diplomatic engagements, the United States is just one of them. Look how active we are in the BRICS. So I think it's very important to understand that that's one of the reasons why India is in the BRICS. I think the membership of the BRICS also rekindles old ties with Russia, and I think that's important for India because India's ties with Russia have sort of really taken a hammering over the last decade and a half. Also builds a much needed bridge to China, which again I think desperately India needs. So if under this rubric of these five countries, there can be an annual summit, where Indian and Chinese leadership meet. That I think is in a way a net plan. Because it gives one opportunity at least for angularity that exists in a bilateral relationship to be worked out at least once a year in a multilateral setting. And I would suggest that although New Delhi has a marked preference for IPSA, the BRICS, has become an alternate forum for both routine and high-level interaction with Brasilia and Pretoria as well. There are some indicators that India is saying, okay, the BRICS exists, let's make the most of it, and let's use it to sort of in a way strengthen our links with each of these four countries. I think that's one very important reason why India is in the BRICS. Okay, So what's the bottom line here? The second point that I made is a fairly elaborate point, but there was no way I had to really look at each of these countries and their different motives. What's the bottom line? The bottom line is that the 5 BRICS countries are hegemonic and revisionist, but they're counter-hegemonic or contra-hegemonic and revisionist to different degrees. And also, as suggested in the case of India, the difference may be of kind, not necessarily, or not just perhaps of degree. Something that we need to think about. And this is the way I will put it to you. The faster the pace at which the relative power of the US declines, the better it would be from the perspective of China, the better it would be from the perspective of Russia, the better it would be from the perspective of Brazil. The quicker the pace of the relative decline of the United States. In the case of South Africa, perhaps. I would suggest to you that the same cannot necessarily be said with confidence about India. And the reason is this. For India, it's always going to be a question of swapping US global hegemony for Chinese continental hegemony. And I think that question at the core of power relations. It is one of the reasons why, of all the 5 BRICS countries, on this question of the pace of the relative decline of US power, I think India is and will remain the most reticent of these 5 countries. Okay, I'm moving on to the third of the reasons why I think there is a problem with the way the BRICS are being constructed. In systemic terms, Brazil, India, and South Africa are all aspirants for a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. Why is the UN Security Council important? Because it is the organized structure, organized institution of the global power structure. There is only one organized institution of the global power structure, that is the UN Security Council. And in sharp contrast, as we all know, Russia and China are already occupants. It does not necessarily mean, I hasten to add, that the interests of the 3 aspirants and the 2 occupants are opposed. I don't want to say something as facile and as crude as that. It could well be that in the future expansion of the UNSC, Russia and China may choose to facilitate the permanent entry of the other 3 BRICS countries. It's a possibility. Nevertheless, on questions of pace, sequence, and timing, the 3 aspirants and the 2 occupants may view the matter very differently. So, even if we, build a future scenario in which Russia and China will not oppose South Africa, Brazil, and India becoming members of the UN Security Council, there may be huge issues, which will be the contextual issues, the actual contingent issues, which is how it's done, when it's done, what the pace, the sequence is, timing is, and that sort of stuff. In terms of global economic roles, Russia and South Africa are primary exporters. They export primary commodities. South African economy also obviously benefits from a very robust tourism service sector. Manufacturing predominates in the Chinese economy, now seen widely as the workshop of the world, the factory of the world. India is where the service sector is now increasingly prominent. Brazil actually presents a very mixed picture because it has dynamic agricultural sector. It's one of the most dynamic agricultural sectors in the world. It has in fact a very dynamic manufacturing sector, and it has a strong service sector as well. So Brazil is a bit like Australia actually, when it comes to sort of sectoral industries, Australia is like that as well. That you cannot say Australia is agrarian. It is agrarian, but it's also a resource extraction economy. It's also a high-tech manufacturing economy. It's also very strong in services. And that Brazil is like that as well. Now, I'm not suggesting that the interests of the 5 are necessarily competitive. In fact, their economies are in some ways complementary, because resource abundance in Russia, Brazil, and South Africa leads to many complementarities to the resource dependence of China and India. So within the BRICS itself, you've got these 3 massive resource supplying countries, and you've got these 2 resource purchasing resource dependent countries. But the future trajectories, I would suggest, are distinct and different. And size, as I suggest, also matters in international politics, particularly in the context of power transition and status transformation. And compared to the other 4 BRICS countries, all of which are territorially and demographically massive, South Africa is very much smaller. So, again, there is just that sort of angularity there as well. In terms of development levels, 4 of the BRICS countries are still developing. Russia is the only developed country in the grouping. And Russia is, let us remember, a developed country. We saw that when it came to, the per capita electric power consumption, right? Given the large masses of poverty in India, China and Brazil, it will still be some decades of sustained and equitable development before they could be regarded as developed. So, any way in which, no matter what their growth rates are, the fact is China, India and Brazil are still for another generation really going to be developing countries. They are not going to be able to make the switch that, say, for instance, South Korea was able to make in a period of 15 or 20 years. Go from being really a third world country to a first world country. That's simply not possible in the case of countries of continental dimension like China, India, and Brazil, all of which are very large areas of mass poverty. And therefore, although they may all be in favor of some form of power transition, the BRICS countries have different attributes and are likely to therefore have different trajectories. And I'll also suggest, I think what is probably my final point on this, which is that by any reasonable set of criteria, only Brazil, India and South Africa can be considered as emerging powers. But another thing, we often say that all 5 of them are emerging powers. Only Brazil, South Africa and India are emerging powers. While China is an emerging economy, it is a rising power, not an emerging power. I emphasize this point over and over again in my writings. I don't think it's a semantic point. I think it's a very valid point. Because unlike emerging powers, which could have a systemic impact in the future, a rising power already has a systemic impact today. So China has a systemic impact today. So it really makes very little sense for us in that sense to put these 3 countries, Brazil, India and South Africa, in the same category as we would put China. And China's impact on multiple aspects of the international system, the world economy, are obviously no longer in doubt. Russia cannot be regarded as an emerging power by any criterion because it has been a great power ever since the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, the whole notion of Russia as emerging is just, basically taking a concept and blowing a massive hole in it. You may as well, call it something else. It just derives the concept of any kind of definitional coherence if you start considering Russia to be an emerging power. Russia is like France and Britain. It is a former great power that is now facing a situation of relative decline. And this trend has been exacerbated, obviously, by Russia's declining and aging population. Finally, and this is the 4th reason why I'm very hesitant about the BRICS. It may make a lot of economic and political sense for Brazil and South Africa to bring China and Russia into regular dialogue. It may also be in the interest of China and Russia for the BRICS to be strengthened. However, Brazil and South Africa must then be willing to get entangled in the complex geopolitics of Eurasia. That's the point which I emphasize a lot when I interact with my colleagues in Brazil and South Africa. I tell them that, look, you guys don't quite understand what geopolitics is. How geopolitics is played out on this landmass called Eurasia. Although separated from the Eurasian landmass by vast oceans, the 2 southern hemisphere powers in the BRICS will in the future find themselves being dragged into the northern hemisphere disputes over territory and resources. This is something that I am willing to predict. And I think the sheer mass of China, India and Russia has always led to speculation about what could happen if they were to work together. The underlying idea is that if Russia, China and India were to act in concert, they could play a world historical role. And this goes back to Lenin in 1923. Just to let you know, we know that this is an idea which is very respectable antecedent. Lenin observed in 1923 in an article in Grandeza that in the last analysis, the outcome of the struggle will be determined by the fact that Russia, India and China account for the overwhelming majority of the population of the globe. That idea that somehow these 3 countries were to act in concert, everything will change. But the point is, can they? Can these 3 countries act in concert? What are the factors that are likely to work for or against the idea of China, Russia and India coming together? And I'm just pointing out three factors here. Economic growth rates, competitiveness and cooperation, socio-political dimensions pertaining to such issues as social cohesion, national unity and territorial integrity. Don't forget that these countries impact on each other in very, very negative ways. If there are 10 million Chinese-speaking people in Siberia today, it is necessarily a national security challenge, if not a national security threat for the Russian Federation. They may not quite be articulating in terms of threat yet, or maybe, our chairperson will tell us that they already are. But that's the point. And wherever you look at it, whether it's Tibet and Xinjiang, whether it's Indian Northeast, whether it's Siberia, some of those areas, it's these three countries rubbing against each other that are causing the conflict. That's where the sparks are coming from. And then, of course, there are questions of ideology, politics, and stability. This is stuff that this audience will know, so I'm going to just move on very quickly. Now, if the BRICS grouping in its current configuration survives over the coming years, it would imply one of two scenarios. And I'll lay out both scenarios for you. Both are equally plausible/implausible. The first is that the mutual antagonism between Russia, China, and India would have been resolved, thanks perhaps to the catalytic role played by the two non-Eurasian countries in the grouping. That somehow they continue to work together, habits of cooperation emerge, so on and so forth, and in the process, something wonderful happens. The centuries-long kind of problem between China, Russia, and India somehow over time, dilutes, maybe evaporates. The other scenario is that Brasilia and Pretoria could over time become accustomed to balancing the contradictory pulls and pressures emanating from New Delhi, Beijing, and Moscow. So they will just, become in a way a part of the northern hemisphere geopolitics, just learn to play the game. And so, keep the grouping going, while getting these contradictory pulls and stuff. And then finally, very briefly, a non-issue called democracy. I think, a lot of people, when one is skeptical about the BRICS, but that's because there's a normative preference for democracy. And I have to get correct from the Indian point of view, in fact, not the argument at all. I'm willing to get to this in the Q&A session. Democracy has never been a feature of Indian foreign policy, and I think there are very good reasons for that, and I think there are very good reasons why that's going to remain the same. Let alone democratization. I think even democracy has not been a part of Indian foreign policy. Democratization, just forget about it. And I think in fact democracy is much more important fact in the foreign policy of Brazil and South Africa. Because they are, relatively young democracies, they have recent histories of democratic transition and consolidation. And so in a way, democracy has much greater traction in the public life of South Africa and Brazil than actually it does in Indian public life. At least as far as the external, the foreign policy dimension is concerned. Okay, we've gone through a lot of ground, but have patience. I'll try to wrap this up in another 7 to 8 minutes. There's one important section I still do need to talk about. And if I don't talk about it, it will give you a very imbalanced kind of a presentation. It will be just saying what the problems of the BRICS are. I want to spend a bit of time sort of laying out the antithesis, which is saying that really there is a core need for the BRICS in the international system today, despite everything I've said. And I think my view of skepticism by now should be more than evident. But let me still say that there is a compelling reason for the BRICS. And I call them the 10 P's of global governance. Global governance itself has emerged over the last 15 years from obscurity to become really in some ways a seminal idea of international relations. It is about, for to be very simple, it's about how power operates in an interdependent environment in the absence of government. If you don't have government, but you have interdependence, what do you do? And that in a way encapsulates the problem of the international system today. You don't have a world government, yet you're interdependent. What do you do? That's where global governance comes into the picture. And there's a growing sense that the transformation of the structures of global governance is desperately needed, urgently needed. And that is where the BRICS do become extremely relevant, because they are the only countries that can convincingly challenge the status quo. No other country, grouping of countries can. It can be only the BRICS. And And these then, my friends, are what I call the 10 P's of global governance: participation, presence, permanence, host, problems, postures, positions, policies, programs, and power. As you can see, alliteration is something that not only I quite enjoy, but sort of in some ways is the way I think. What are they? I'm going to very, very briefly go over each of these 10 P's. Participation is about having a role in the taking of decisions that have an impact on one's present situation and future possibilities. Participation by itself does not imply or require a presence in decision-making institutions and structures. And a very good example of that are the small island developing countries that this, which are trying to have a voice in the global climate change decisions. They're not saying, put us on this body, but they're saying, give us a voice. This affects us in a very fundamental sense. We want a voice. That's participation. Presence is about the right to be a part of decision-making institutions and structures. A good recent example in the context of the BRICS is the incorporation of Russia, role issue with the incorporation of Russia into the WTO. Permanence is a special form of presence. It is about the lack of any exit or sunset clause. Permanence, obviously the best example are the G4, Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan, and their attempt to become UN Security Council members with permanent veto leading seats. The issue of posts relates not to decision-making roles, which is what we've been talking about, but rather to the possession of executive authority. It is about who occupies positions of significance in the institutions that deal with global issues and have a global impact. Leadership of the Bretton Woods institutions, with the presidency of the World Bank reserved for an American and the directorship of the IMF reserved for a European, that's a classic example of a posts problem. And I suspect that this aspect of global governance is in fact the one that's going to be, because it's the most visible, is the one that's going to be dealt with the first as well. Problems, of course, lie at the heart of global governance and are its most visible issue, rather than posts. And contemporary global problems, I think, are of three different types, but these problems are often confused and conflated. So I'm going to very briefly break down the way I see global problems. They require ingenuity, the ability to think out of the box. They require novel approaches. The second set of problems are old problems, such as world trade, urbanization, energy and resource scarcity, that require new approaches and solutions because the old approaches no longer work. And here, what we can see is a renewed emphasis on multilateralism, which can be helpful in finding new solutions to these problems. And the third are old problems with old solutions but new actors. And these are the problems that are impacted by the ongoing hegemonic decline and power transition. Here we have a range of position security issues, such as stealing of communication, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, so on and so forth. So one of the problems is that we talk about all of these global problems as if they're one set of problems. They aren't. They're actually three very different types of problems, and they actually really require three very different approaches. Postures and positions are prioritized statements of interests, preferences, and negotiating stances. Postures are general, positions are specific. Postures represent an overall approach to a problem, while positions lay down the limits of what is negotiable. Postures tend to be tacit and implicit, while positions are explicit and usually declared. Yet postures and positions go very close together, go very closely together. Policies are plans or courses of action that are intended to influence and determine decisions, actions, and other matters. In the Delhi Declaration, for instance, there's a very strong statement about the nature of the World Bank and how it must shift, from being one that really mediates North-South cooperation to an institution that really promotes equal partnership. For me, that's a classic example of policy. In contrast, programs are systems of projects, of services consisting of a series of steps to be carried out as well as goals to be accomplished that meet a public need. And here a very concrete example of a program in the BRICS context is a decision at the BRICS New Delhi Summit to examine the possibility of setting up a BRICS development bank. That's a classic example of a program, a specific project, and that's different from the rest of the policy. And finally, the last of the 10 P's, the alpha and omega of it all, is power. Now, the power of the BRICS, I suggest to you, will depend upon 5 interlocking factors: their economic growth rate, the ingenuity and vitality of their society, the relative power of regional rivals and extra-regional competitors, their ability to project their prominence in ways that others perceive as benign and attractive, and finally the speed at which the power of the systemic hegemon declines relative to their own increasing power. So all 5 of these, and there are some interlocking elements, are going to together determine what is the actual power that the BRICS have relative to other states in the system. So future directions then. And I'm really down to my last 5 transparencies, so you can, it's almost done. I suggest 3 things that need to be done, really, if the BRICS are going to get anywhere close to fulfilling their potential. If they're not going to just remain, a grouping of 5 countries. I think the grouping needs to consider expanding, first of all. This may sound very bizarre, you think there is group cohesion, add a few more. I mean, it's counterintuitive. It's like, surely if you add more, you create even bigger problems, group cohesion. But I think that there's a compelling argument for 3 countries minimally being added to the BRICS, and they are Turkey, Indonesia, and Mexico. Let me make the case for all 3 of them very briefly. The most compelling reason for Turkish inclusion is that the lack of an Islamic country in the grouping weakens its position. Turkey is one of those countries, that really in a fundamental sense, hedges. It's a hedge country. Huntington in the categorizations called it one of the 3 tone countries along with Mexico and Russia, as belonging in the Huntingtonian kind of sense of different civilizations. And I think Turkey at the moment is doing incredibly well economically. Turkey finally, I think, giving up on this whole, the chimera, the whole thing about becoming a part of the European Union. It will be a very good time to think of bringing Turkey in. Indonesia would also add a useful dimension, not only in terms of its Islamic identity, but also as a hedge against Sino-Indian polarization. I think we have another large, hefty Asian country there. This danger of China and India out there breaking group solidarity and cohesion, I think Indonesia would add that. I think Mexico is interesting because Mexico provides northern hemisphere balance in some ways to Brazil. I think the Brazilians need to have another Latin American country in there. Let's begin to, the Grandeza element about, trust and only us. I think the second change is that the grouping needs to become an organization with a permanent secretariat. At the moment, the inclination in the BRICS countries is to have a virtual secretariat. They've been very 21st century about it. But I think in order to keep the organization geographically distant and aloof from northern hemisphere geopolitics, a permanent secretariat really should be ideally located in either South Africa or Brazil. And of course, if you're going to set up a secretariat, why not do it in a nice place like Cape Town or Rio de Janeiro, And the third is the point I had made a little earlier, right at the beginning, which is that the grouping needs to snap the umbilical cord that is inherent in its name. Once the permanent secretariat is established, the grouping could be renamed as a cooperation organization, for example. The organization could take on the name of either its city of location or founding. It's not because it's our idea. I'll give you a bunch of other such examples. Prominent past and current examples include the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Warsaw Treaty Organization, the London Suppliers Group, the Wassenaar Arrangement, the Australia Group. So it's not an idea which is completely out of, from way out there. I mean, this has been a part over the 20th century of such practice. So the Cape Town Cooperation Organization, for example, would have a rather nice ring to it. Conclusion, I'm on my last 2 transparencies now. And this is really in some ways the bottom line of what has been. Of course, I think I recognize a rather bloated presentation, but I couldn't think of any other way of doing this. The BRICS will become a genuinely revisionist force in global governance and world politics more broadly, only if they are able to transform themselves from what they are today, which is a conglomeration of 5 large states with varied interests, into an organization that has the ability to strategically add new members should the need arise. This, I think, for me, is the core bottom line. At the moment, the BRICS are nothing more and nothing less than a conglomeration of 5 large states, all revisionists to some degree or the other, with varied interests. By creating a permanent secretariat, the BRICS in plural, in English, the definite article G is the same for singularity and plurality. In Portuguese, it isn't. Basically moving from us-BRIC to u-BRICS, from a plural kind of the BRICS as plural to BRICS as singular. You need a permanent secretariat for that. Otherwise, it's going to be a conglomeration of 5 countries, and they're going to continue to become themselves fundamentally as a plural. To make it a singular, we need an organization. And in order to escape both the northern hemisphere of geopolitics and southern hemisphere of Grandeza, the permanent secretariat should ideally be located well south of the equator. Thank you so much for having listened so patiently. Thank you, Chairperson.